Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm Paul Frields.
And I'm Dave Guzman.
And welcome to Practical Bass, where our mission is to help you elevate your gigs and gear by exploring a new practical topic in being a working bassist each week. You can find us on the web at practicalbass.com. You can email us at podcast@practicalbass.com. You can also find us on iTunes, on Google Play Music, on Stitcher Radio, and through the website. You can use us with any podcatching app that you have on your computer or mobile device. And we do welcome your feedback on this show and any ideas that you have for future shows. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to connect with you guys and hear about your experiences as a working bassist. So Dave, what are we going to talk about today? I think this was one of your pet topics, right?
It was, yeah. So, Paul, today we're going to talk about when your sound goes sideways.
So this isn't like an excursion into wine country,
Right.
where Paul Giamatti takes a road trip with you. Because that actually sounds pretty great, actually.
It does.
Going through Napa.
Because it would be a good situation.
Yeah, with your bass and Paul Giamatti.
Right.
No,
this is
fun.
This is the bad sideways. This is like not the straight, but the left turn.
Yeah, like left turn into the Badlands.
Yeah, the rut row.
The row.
That's a technical term.
Raggy?
Yeah, that's a technical term.
Oh my gosh. So where did this topic spring from? Just, from the mind of Dave.
Yeah. Yeah, so I put this topic in the pool because it was the day after I was playing a gig, and it was at a really small venue, like a kind of a French restaurant, but it's in the like where the specific like breakout of the space was just this kind of cube that the drummer's like all the way in the back, and there's walls all around, and then it opens up into the room. It's just the corner. It's
so you're jammed into like almost an alcove or something.
Exactly. What happened is right from the start, my sound was just bad. Like when I tested it at first, it sounded fine, and something happened where all of a sudden I'm just in mud. I'm swimming through mud. All the high end is off. And what it did for me is it threw my head out. So I'm not focused on the music, on what we're playing. I'm just completely like dwelling in the fact that my sound is wrong.
Like there's no way to have fun at that type of gig because you weren't enjoying your own sound.
Yeah. And so the fun goes out. Then all of a sudden you're thinking about the vocals and what you're doing there. And that probably sounds bad. Then you're thinking about the notes, and then just regular changes that you normally do in your song are all of a sudden wrong. You're slipping up. And I realized I was in that hole. I was in that black hole.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really, for me, it's if you're playing a lot of shows, it's the inevitable. You're always going to hit up a space where something's not working right.
Right.
And so, for me, it was just one of those situations where like I wake up the next morning and it's one of those Better Call Paul moments. Like, Paul, this happened.
I'm going to have my own AMC show soon. Better Call Paul.
Better Call Paul. When the bass goes sideways. So yeah, so that turmoil made me think, I'm sure I'm not the only person that this happens to. Like because it happened not often, but every now and then I'm just in a space where it just doesn't turn out right, and it's a downward spiral. And so I thought there's got to be a way to like better manage this.
Yeah. And you're definitely not the only person who's run into this. I've had, I can't tell you how many times I've had like sound goes bad on stage. And, I usually operate as sound man for my band too. So
right,
there are all sorts of things on top of the bass that can go wrong. Right. And that's a whole other podcast channel unto itself, probably.
Yeah. Cause now you're multiplying.
Right.
Now we're on everybody else's sound.
Yeah. There's like an order of magnitude more problems that can happen. But in terms of the bass, I've had that gremlin kind of hit me numerous times. Just a few weeks ago, I remember doing a small gig with my band, and we come back from break, and, you know, I have everything is set basically for, you know, tuner mode or whatever. So I pick up my bass, I do my tuning, et cetera, et cetera. And for whatever reason, right, I make the bonehead error of, you know, not giving those couple quick boop, boop, just make sure that like the things are happening.
The tester.
Groovy, right?
Right.
Drummer starts off the groove for the song, right? And we come to the top, and I hit a string and nothing comes out.
It's perfect.
Yeah. And I just like, you know, and of course, like within a beat, I'm basically looking around at everybody. I'm like, you know, telling the drummer and kind of giving him the, you know, bring it back around.
Keep it rolling.
You know, making sure the guitar player sees me. And I'm like, yeah, just, you know, give me a vamp while I figure out what's going on here. And then have to figure out what happened. And it turned out that something had got unplugged when people were leaving the stage. Somebody probably tripped over a cable or, yeah. And it was, it's just one of those things where, you know, it just throws you, right? You're having a great gig and suddenly, or you're preparing to have a great gig and then suddenly, you know, the carpet gets just yanked out from under you. And that's just, it's no fun.
Yeah. Then you're all like frontal lobe, survival, tunnel vision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spinning. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, and it's a funny topic for me because I feel like the only time I always think about, wow, it'd be great if I, like at every gig, if I could just really tune my sound to that venue, right? But that's totally impossible. So when I'm trying to figure out my amp and my settings and, you know, my bass, it's usually within my own home studio, which is like anybody else's home, like a room, right? A small room.
Right.
With furniture in it.
Right.
Enclosed
your man cave or lady cave, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. A little bigger than a closet.
Yeah.
Not much bigger. And the sound is always great because you're just like 2 feet away from it. And it's always just, it has that milkiness. You can hear the highs because you're right there. It's perfectly set in for that room. But that's just one room. So, you know, there's, you know, all these different, the sound that I feel, you know, that you get when you're working on your equipment is always going to be completely different than any other venue.
Yeah. Well, you get to control every aspect, right? You determine like where your amp's sitting, where you're sitting. You don't have to worry about being in someone else's way or how much room you have or where the cable's running. And, you know, and it's, and you have endless time to twiddle everything to make it perfect. Right?
Exactly.
At home, it's great because everything can be under your control.
Yeah. And you're not competing with other musicians. It's just you. Just you and the bass.
Yeah. And everything can sound great there. But then, you know, suddenly when you're in the playing, the playing situation, there's, like you said, there's other instruments to compete with. And what sounded great, maybe that setting sounded great at home.
Right.
And you bring your amp in and suddenly it doesn't sound good when you get together with all the other instruments. Like maybe the bass is getting lost, or maybe it's really loud and annoying and your bandmates think you're, you know, they look at you funny and they're like, yeah, it doesn't, you know, it's something doesn't sound right.
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 How do you pick up like where you are compared to your bandmates?
I find that there are a lot of people that I play with who don't necessarily key in on the bass sound itself. And so I try to, you know, I definitely invite feedback, right? I think one of the most important things you can do is definitely ask, right? Ask for feedback and invite it. Like ask your bandmates, you know, am I too loud? Do I sound too boomy? Or do I sound very, you know, do I sound really twangy to you or really like too crispy? You know, you can use, there's like a whole lexicon of words you can try and
so
use
many
to
adjectives.
describe your sound, you know, and they'll tell you, oh yeah, well it's barking, but it's not growling, right? Like, like I'm not an animal. But I mean, you can definitely get some feedback that way. You know, I find that opening the door for that feedback is important, right? Don't be afraid to hear from your bandmates about it. But honestly, a lot of the bands I play in, you know, they're really kind of just depending on me to do my part. And they're not going to get super, super critical about the bass, right? Other than like if I'm really loud and causing the stage volume to go up, I think I actually have maybe the opposite issue, whereas sometimes I really don't turn up as much as maybe some people would like me to.
Right.
And so they have to tell me to turn up. I guess that in my mind, that's, if I have to make an error, that's the way I'd like to err, right? Just not
Absolutely.
seem like oh, it's all about me and the bass.
Right. Right. No, it's true. It's definitely true. And for the same reason why I think you have to ask your bandmates for that feedback, because they're in their own world. We're all getting set up. There's, always a little bit of anxiety right before you hit a show.
Right.
And if for example, you're too loud or too boomy, everyone has a tendency to play louder.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To adjust to what's going on, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe you need to like dial it back.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think the tendency is that, people don't want to get super critical, about each other on stage, because it doesn't set the stage for a fun gig. Right.
Right.
And so people will just, there's kind of a give and take almost. And this is, it's just part of the chemistry of a band to do that.
Sure. Like a balance of being self-aware, but at the same time of like asking for feedback and that area.
Yeah. Have that I think that's really the advice we're trying to give up front is just, number one, at a gig, be receptive to feedback. And if somebody asks you for it, be generous and gentle with it. Right. And I think if everybody does that, you can have a great experience, even if something goes crazy wrong at the gig.
It's true.
You get along and everything will be okay. I mean, and there are things you can do physically, right, to set yourself up for maybe a better gig from the get-go, just in terms of getting your sound in a place that you like it to start with. Right. Like set yourself up to maybe avoid some of the pitfalls. One thing that comes to mind is if you have an amp that is rear ported, right? And by that, I guess, we mean if you look at the front and back of bass cabinets, oftentimes they're ported. And what that means is you'll see sort of an empty space that basically leads right back into the body of the cabinet. Like a lot of times you can't really reach your hand back there, but there's clearly a space.
Yep.
Right. And, what that space is for is to allow some of the low bass information or sound waves to kind of like leak out through those ports.
Right.
It kind of accentuates the ultra low end. And you'll find those in some cabinets on the front, and you'll find them in other cabinets on the back. I have, the cabinets that I use primarily right now have rear ports on them.
Right.
And a lot of cabinets do, and some of them do that to save space, right? If you put ports in the front, you still have to have the entire grill for your speakers and then add ports to that. So the cabinet gets bigger. Right.
Taller
taller or wider, one or the other.
Yep.
Right. And if you put them in the back, then you can just build it into the profile of the cabinet, right? The cabinet doesn't have to get any bigger than the grill on the front already is, if that makes sense. And so, those rear ports, because they let the low end, the super low end out through those ports, if you want, you can actually control the amount of low end boost on your amp, on your cabinet, by backing it up against a surface, right?
Yep.
And this is something that, like in studios, they tell you about setting up studio monitors is, be careful about, backing them up to a wall, because essentially what you're going to do is your mixes are going to sound very bass heavy.
Yeah.
And, then suddenly you take your mix out to a regular room or a well-tuned set of monitors or, whatever.
Yeah.
And it sounds really wimpy.
Right.
Because you were getting all this artificial low end. And the same thing's true of these bass cabinets, right? You push up against a wall or a corner, especially a corner, and it just, I mean, it'll take the low end like through the roof.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's actually what happened to me in that restaurant gig, is that I've got a rear port, and when I took a second look at the set break, I realized I'm almost flush up against the wall. That's it. I just rolled all my high end off, and it sounded legit crazy.
Yeah.
Just crazy.
Just like super boomy.
Yeah.
I think other than that, at a gig, I will often try not to be too crazy about the low end of my amp. If I'm on a stage with a lot of people, like, I've got like 5 or 6 members in a band.
Yeah.
Maybe one's a keyboard player, who's got, kind of a lot of low end. There might be a couple guitars. And of course the guitars have their own flavor of low end.
Yep.
I will try not to over accentuate that in those situations. Like I wouldn't say, I won't drain it out, right? Because the bass is there for lows, but sometimes I'll kind of let, I'll do a direct feed to the PA. And if we've got some subwoofers out there on the floor, I'll kind of let them carry some of it so it doesn't get so boomy on the stage. And that's a larger setup, right? And it either depends on, either you're bringing that kind of equipment to the gig, or maybe you're playing in a house with, where they have their own front of house sound man who can take care of that for you.
Right.
And in a smaller gig, you may not have that luxury, right? All the low end that you're getting may have to be your amp.
Right.
Right. And so, I think in those situations, what I tend to do is try not to be too crazy with the low mids as opposed to the actual low lows.
Right.
Right. Because the low lows, you're basically more or less, you're competing with probably the kick drum.
That's right.
At worst.
Right.
Right. And not many other people. Like maybe, and I'm thinking like this is in the 60 or 80 hertz region.
Yep.
And that's actually cool to kind of like lock that in with the kick drum, be as loud as the kick drum essentially.
That's right. Yeah.
And people on the stage are going to feel like that sounds like a good mix usually at that point. And the low mids, which it depends on the amp, but a lot of times those are going to be, 200, 250 hertz or something like that. Depends on the amp, and look at your manufacturer manual. But if you find something that's in that area, I tend to that's like, if I give it anything, it's going to be very little. I might even roll it off if the stage is boomy. I might take it back a little bit.
Yeah. And so you're talking about the low mid versus like the high mid. Do you manipulate the high mid at all, or is that also kind of flat?
Well, I guess to taste, if, active basses, I usually leave it flat, but if I have a passive bass, I might actually, that's usually the area that I like to scoop out just a bit, by default, right? Because I like having sort of a little bit of a smile.
Right.
Depends on the music I'm playing, but, a lot of times if I'm playing, in an R&B or a funky type band, I love taking that out, like, 600 or 800 hertz, like pulling a bit of that out, and it makes the bass growl kind of come out a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. And then maybe I might poke the highs up just a bit.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I was thinking about, like, when you think back to some, really to things that do go sideways, like when it really goes bad. And a lot of those for me is in that mid range. There's something weird about the mids that doesn't work, or if they just get drowned out, or the highs get drowned out. Like a lot of it, I think, is in the EQ, or, just those kind of dramatic sounds that just sit wrong.
Yeah.
But there are other things too. Like there's I've had a couple of times where I'm competing with somebody else on stage, like something's happening where it does, I don't even know what the term is, but I call it like the frequency storm.
Yeah.
Like where you get the wah-wah effect, like something is just, someone's either out of tune or something's going on that it creates that, like in a certain part of your neck at a certain note, all of a sudden things are going in and out.
Right. There's like you'll find like a natural resonance, right?
Yes.
There's like a frequency resonance that happens in certain spaces where, the waves are meeting in a certain way. Some of it even depends on where you're actually standing. Like if you move a foot to the right or the left,
Right.
it goes away.
Right.
The thing that I run into a lot of times is that the hollow stage effect, right?
Yep.
You get on a stage, the underneath is hollow, and suddenly like you're not turned up very high, and the bass just sounds enormously boomy,
Yep.
like out of control. And it's because really the low end of the bass is carrying down into the wood of the stage and into the airspace
Yep.
under the stage, and you can feel it like almost rattle your feet. And that can throw you too, right? Because your bandmates will think that you're too loud, but you can barely hear the mid-range or the highs out of your amp because the lows are just like overwhelming it, right?
Right. And then you lose all of your articulation and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you just feel like, and you start playing differently, right? You don't feel like you can dig in certain parts because of the boominess. So yeah, those are the times where I might actually take some lows out of the bass.
Yeah. And I started, actually, I have a makeshift sort of stand that I use because I found that happens more often than I'd like. And so I just bring with me, a 1 foot lift that just takes my amp off the floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to purely avoid that.
And the other thing about taking your amp off the floor that we should point out is that many times your volume or your sound is going to be influenced by where your amp is pointed, right?
Yeah.
If your amp is sitting on the floor, it's at best, it might be pointing at like your knees, right?
Right.
Or your posterior.
Right.
And that's it. Now there is a nice thing about having like that bass kind of hit you in the booty like that.
Sure.
But at the same time, if you don't hear any definition, one of the things to think about is, can I move my amp in such a way that I'm hearing more of its sound at my ears, right?
Right.
I don't mean necessarily taking your entire bass amp and then putting it like, lifting it 3 feet or 4 feet up. But if you can do, either like a tilt back or just get it high enough that the vertical range of the sound is actually like part of it is getting your ears.
Yep.
You'll hear your highs better. You'll hear that definition, and you play a little better because you can hear what you're doing.
Right. Right. Because at the end of the day, whether it's on the floor or raised a bit, the audience may not know the difference. But if you do, if it's in your head and you can't hear it, that's where trouble happens.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Then you feel like you're in the dark a bit. So in those situations, like when things do really go sideways, what are some things that you shouldn't do? Like what are the absolute, like, don't do this?
Well, I guess, everybody's got different rules about this. I have a couple. One of them is don't ignore your bandmates, right? If they're trying to let you know either during a song or after a song or something that something is wrong, try and take it seriously.
Yeah.
That helps. It helps them understand that, you care about their opinions, that you're trying to work with the group, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of attitude will go a long way, right?
Yeah.
To help and ensure that you can keep a gig too, right? If this isn't your regular band, it's not guys that you're playing with all the time. You develop a certain chemistry with those people. But if this is a gig that you picked up, you want to make sure people understand that you're there to do your job. And if you're not performing satisfactorily in their mind, you want to fix that, right?
Right.
And you want to let them know that, that performance is important to you. So I think that's one thing is just, listen. The second thing I think is just, don't panic, right? It's really easy to let that throw you, but remember that, we're talking about music here. It's live music. It's not heart surgery.
Right.
No one's going to die if you're a little boomy or if if your bass seems a little weak to you. Keep that in perspective and, try to avoid getting into a space where you think so much about that you're like missing cues or not thinking about what you're doing. And
Yeah.
it's hard to do, right? I have this issue too, but it's something that I try and repeat to myself is, it'll be okay, right? Just let's get a handle on what's going on here.
Don't be so sensitive. You're the bassist. Don't be sensitive.
Right.
No, but it's true. I think that, that's a great point. And that's part of, I think for me, like what I struggle with is not necessarily taking myself too seriously, but to some extent, like, yeah, like it's not half the time that I think something is going wrong. When I ask people, friends that are maybe out listening or my bandmates, they don't even know that it's happening, which is crazy, right? Because for me, it's like a huge thing and
right.
It's not that big a deal at the end of the day.
Yeah. When you see someone else's perspective or hear it, you're, oh yeah, well, okay. All right. I get it. It's just me.
Right. And so for me, like one of my rules is that I try to stick to is right in that same topic. Just don't obsess about it. Don't get so drilled into that piece, and it's going to be okay. Just get through it when you get a good break. That if it's not that big of a deal, like if it's a big deal, yeah, deal with it and fix it. Like if there's no sound, take care of that because you don't want to play a set without sound. That would be a poor performance. You shouldn't accept pay.
You guys were great, but I couldn't hear the bass at all.
The other piece that I think is important is to remember that when you in a gig, when you are playing on a paid event, you are being hired to do a job, and part of that job is the performance and the way that you put yourself out there. So when something is wrong, trying to avoid those like facial expressions or the body language that makes it look like the ship is sinking.
Right.
Because for the same reason that the audience probably doesn't even know that like your mids are not set right, or the high end is getting rolled off, or it's too boomy or whatever, or there's like some scratchiness, or you're hitting a note in a certain part of your neck that's not like popping the way you would like. Nobody really cares that much.
Right.
So don't ruin the experience of the viewers that are there to like, either they paid a cover to get there, or that's their one night out, that to have that experience where they see a musician that's sort of down and out or struggling, or that like mad scientist, like, with the hair sticking up, like, what is this? That's not what you're paid to do.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with that. That's such an insightful point.
So of all the, I know there's a multitude of different things that could go south, but just in general, what are some like appropriate steps that you take when you're playing live and something goes wrong?
One of the things that I have really gotten into in the last 5 years, I've really gotten into active basses. And because they give me like a measure of EQ control where I don't have to turn back to my amp and I don't have to kind of figure things out there.
Yep.
A lot of times nowadays, I will flatten my EQ on the amp more or less.
Okay.
And really control it from the bass.
Yep.
The first thing I do before I start playing with EQ or anything like that, right? Because usually I'll have the bass set and things will feel right there. And like I said, my amp is a lot of times it's flat, but even if it's not, if I'm playing a passive bass, before I start mucking around with the amp EQ, I just look around. Is the amp positioned in a way that I can hear it where I'm standing on stage, right? Or have things moved around to where like I'm kind of standing to the side and I'm not really hearing the real true sound of the amp? Is there a way that I should relocate to make that work? Or should I get the amp moved so that it's hitting my ears a little better so I can really hear what's going on?
Right.
What's the audience hearing?
Yep.
And sometimes I'll use stage monitors to my advantage there too, like run a direct signal. And then if there's a stage monitor that I have for my vocals or whatever, I'll put a little bass in there too, so that I'm not kind of worrying as much about where the amp is pointing or, what sound is hitting my head. because I'm using the monitor to kind of get some of it back to my ears.
Right, because you can't always rely on you can't rely on what you hear based on your where your amp is positioned on stage. Just like as if you're at a larger venue or an outdoor venue, and if you were to fill a whole like big wide open space with your bass amp that's right behind you, and that's it, you're done. Like you're just going to have to drown yourself out so that you can push your sound out there, and you're only like 2 feet from your amp.
Right.
You're going to have natural problems. So like just kind of keying in on what you're hearing and if it's coming through the monitor, or are you just using your amp simply as a monitor?
Right.
And everything else is going through the PA.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I think, then there's the question of, not even the sound is non-optimal, but now you're in the position where there's no sound.
Right.
Things are just missing. And, the don't panic rule applies here. But I start with the bass.
Yep.
Just make sure things are good there. Most importantly.
Right. The volume is turned up.
It's the volume on. I wish I could say I'd never made that mistake, but that has happened.
Yeah, you laugh about it, but it sometimes it's the case.
Yeah, I hope people in the audience are laughing too, and I hope that it never happens to you, but I promise it will. So there is that, and make sure things are plugged in, right? And a lot of times I find that like a cable has come unplugged. So I, go from the bass. Is the bass plugged in? Is that plugged into the amp? Is, or the effects pedals or whatever.
Right.
Right. And trace the chain. Just make sure that the chain is not broken. And, that includes not just going to the effects and the effects up to the head or whatever the case might be, checking the effects loop if there is one, making sure that the speaker cable is still good and attached and stuff. I recently had a speaker jack that went wonky, and I thought I had destroyed my amp and, my amp head, which, was not cheap. And I was really getting upset about it, but while setting up for the gig, because I could, and then
it's also tough to fix at a gig.
Yes, absolutely. That's the thing I was most worried about. Like, what am I going to do here? Like DI to the PA. That's it.
Yeah.
And it turned out that it was basically a pin or a contact in the jack was just kind of gotten pushed back over years and just needed to be nudged back into place. Everything was okay. But that was one of those things that, it took some time to figure it out, and just like being able to maintain calm, go through the chain, figure out all the possibilities, wiggle all the things properly.
Yep.
Right. Is important. Now doing that during a song is impossible, but you have to do the right things at the right time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And finally, I think if something goes bad in the middle of a gig, like during the set, have an agreement with the drummer, like a signal to like keep the beat going, right? Because you don't want the audience to get annoyed by silence or, I'm going to go piddle around with my equipment for 10 minutes on stage. That is absolutely the worst.
Yeah.
So having the drummer and the other musicians able to like, have an agreement about what happens if there's a failure.
Yeah, I really like that. Like pre-establishing a plan B.
Yeah,
because for everybody, it's going to happen. Everybody on stage, it'll happen. So like saying, hey, if this ever happens, we should just, this will be our cue, and then we just kind of keep rolling, or just know that this is happening.
Yeah, and it's rough when that happens with the bass player, right? Because you're so foundational to the sound of the band. But
literally, the bottom drops out.
Yeah. But it is something that you have to be prepared for and cope with.
Yeah, for me, the things that I do is, if something does go wrong, first, if I think that something is wrong, because I'm always afraid that it's just in my head and I'm overthinking it, is I'll quickly, in between a song, if it's minor, I'll ask a bandmate. And I usually have one or two that I know that I can have a quick, like, how's, am I too boomy? Is it weird? What's going on here? Do you hear anything funky going on with my bass? If they say no and they're on stage with me, then I know, all right, just chill out, relax.
Yeah.
Well, if it is a minor thing that I need to tweak, that's me being particular, and I just have to wait till a set break to just like narrow that down. But if things are severely wrong, I do the zero out on all my EQ, everything on my bass, and on any pedals that I have on any on my amp, and I just bring it all to noon, and then just do minor tweaks from there and kind of start from scratch. But I also I've learned to just if something is like acting up, if there's like something funky going on, I'll just immediately like drop back, kick my volume down, like just kind of exit a little bit, so I'm no longer like the big bass out in front.
Yeah.
Just, take a half step back. And of course, just as you said, like if there's some buzzing or a hum or something weird that's like some alternate noise that is not intended to be there, when I do get time, at the next like convenient spot, checking cables, that's it. And a lot of times you just have an old, you got an old power cord or something.
Right. Or your battery's going bad.
Or the battery.
Active, or even in a pedal or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Or maybe it's my intonation. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I'm the intonation guy.
So yeah, I mean, it definitely pays, I think, to take those troubleshooting steps. I mean, do you ever get to the point though where like you take this to maybe a crazy level, like you get to the point where you're thinking about the sound so much that it's a detriment maybe to your playing?
Yeah. Even in my example that we started this off, and it's the learning for me was like, okay, the sound to me was like awful, but no one really noticed it. Like my guitarist did notice it, but the audience didn't, and it's just a matter of it's a gig. It's a musical event. At the end of the day, the people that are watching are just there to like enjoy and have fun. Like it's more important to interact with your, with your audience and with your bandmates than to just get like down this like, down the rabbit hole of negativity and bad thoughts about what your sound is and it's not how it needs to be. Yeah. So it happens to me, and that's something that I continually work on to, scoot past.
Right. Exactly.
What about you?
So I guess I don't like to get too obsessive about sound. Like I'll do that a lot at home, but I try to contain it at gigs. But, I also like to have a sound that I feel really good about. And, on occasion, have other bass players come up and say, "Oh man, your bass sounds great." Like that's right. That's always nice. Like when you hear that, you hear another player tell you they like your sound.
Yep.
That really means something. They could be like joking, like, "I like your sound." Doesn't mean you played well, but I really like your sound. It could be like a backhanded compliment.
Yeah. You have a great personality.
Right. Exactly. But, honestly, I think if I can take just, a decent bass and I've got an okay amp with if it sounds okay with a flat EQ, I probably can get what I like out of it. So, again, I tend to control from the bass, and then that can be my concentration. And the worst thing that happens is like if that goes wrong, I swap my bass the next song or whatever. I really get more obsessive about recording because the show is ephemeral, right? The moment is there, even the hour or 2 or 3 or 4 some nights, it's going to be gone, right?
Yep.
And it's not like anyone's going to tell how good your sound was with YouTube. So I don't really worry about that.
Right.
So unless the show is being recorded in some way, I don't really obsess too much about it because it'll be lost to the ages at the end of the night. And I think that's, again, that and the heart surgery thing, right? Yeah. Just keep it in perspective.
Big picture. That's right.
Yeah.
Well,
it's probably a good place to cut out for today. I hope you guys in the audience have enjoyed this discussion about what to do when your sound goes sideways. This is just one of many episodes that are out there right now on the Practical Bass podcast site. You can subscribe through the Apple Podcast amp. Just search for Practical Bass. You can subscribe the same way from Google Play Music or on Stitcher Radio or on your favorite podcatching app. You can also visit us on the web at practicalbass.com. If you would like to send us an email with a general comment, you're welcome to do that as well. just email podcast@practicalbass.com. And Dave and I read all your comments. We'd love to hear from you guys. We'd love to hear about your pursuits in sound and what works for you and what doesn't. Have you run into a situation where you had to troubleshoot on stage? Let us know. You can also find us on social media and have the conversation there via Facebook or Twitter. We're also on Instagram and Google+. So there are no end of ways that you can get in touch with us. And we will be back next week with another topic of practical interest for you, the working bass player. And until then, I'm Paul Frields.
I'm Dave Guzman.
And this has been Practical Bass.
Thanks for listening. Basically like the mafia scene in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Providence, Rhode Island. And it's a killer.
Providence had a mob scene?
So bad that Bulgy, like Whitey Bulger, reported up.
Bulgy.
Whitey Bulgy. Yeah, I'm going to get fucking knocked off. I'm just saying that.
You're going to get whacked.
I'm going to get whacked.